All right, we're going to get started here. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Lee Archer, and I am the Perennial Systems Scientist here at the Rodale Institute. Today, I'm going to be talking about building resilience using perennial crop production systems, but also building resilience into those systems. Just some webinar etiquette as we get started. Please use the Q&A function on this webinar. If you have any technical questions, you can ask those through the chat, but please use the Q&A function for content-related questions. This webinar is being recorded and it's going to be posted in about a week or so on our website. First, I'd like to thank the Northeast Extension Risk Management Education for their support of our work. And we'll get started. So before we start talking about agricultural resilience, I just want to take a minute to go over the concept of agricultural risk, because this is what we're really building our resilience against. This is going to range from access to markets, human health and relationships, financial liquidity and solvency, compliance, statutes and regulations, and then that's in addition to the risks that growers are experiencing day in and day out as part of the job. Today we're going to really be focusing on production risks. These are the uncertainties that you get in plant growth due to weather, due to climate, soil, water, pests, pathogens, and so we're going to move forward by discussing strategies for production risk management through perennial cropping systems. And when we think about production risk management, we can break down our strategies into three main categories. The first is controlling or minimizing risks through your management practices. This is, consciously or not, this is what growers are doing every day when they perform management activities. And so we'll kind of think of this as a proactive or a reactive practice that targets a specific risk. The second approach is to really build resilience within a system, and that's going to help to reduce the likelihood of production risks emerging, or it could reduce the severity of those risks in the end. And then the final strategy is to transfer these production risks to someone else through programs such as crop insurance or other contracts. I'm not going to be touching much on this final strategy today, but I encourage you to speak with your local extension offices to learn more about these opportunities for your farm, whatever size or whatever features you may have. So here is how we're going to move through with this presentation. First, I'll touch on some of the benefits of perennial production systems and sort of why they are inherently part of a resilient production system. And then we'll go through some of the basics of how you plan for an organic orchard, and then some thoughts about understanding and overcoming both environmental and production risks. So it's a lot to get through. I encourage those of you who are hoping to get into some more specific details to reach out to me. I'll provide my contact information towards the end. So first, why should we consider perennial production systems an approach that inherently creates more resilience in your system? So we're talking about perennial agriculture here. When I say perennial agriculture, I'm referring to the cultivation of species that live for more than 2 years, and they don't need to be replanted. In much of the temperate world, this is going to be seen in the form of orchards where trees are planted for food production. The benefits of these systems can have a positive impact on ecosystem health, soil health, economic viability, and multiple sociocultural aspects when you compare these to many annual production systems. So how do perennials impact ecosystem health? Well, the first step, and sort of the one that most people think about, is that they're providing year-round habitat to encourage biodiversity. Secondly, they can regulate the microclimate of your field, so they are providing shade, or they can act as a windbreak, and they can be planted in fields or areas with less optimal soils or fields that have other physical limitations such as sloping land. And when you're planting a perennial on this land, the root systems can secure the soil to help reduce the risk of landslides or erosion. This in turn can lead to improvements in water quality. So the benefits of trees is something that most people kind of inherently understand, but it really comes down to really the benefits of perennials are, in general, ecosystem health is one of the main ones. Secondly, is the benefits to soil health in particular. So when you're growing a perennial system, you're automatically going to be reducing the amount of tillage that you're doing. And by reducing tillage, you can see increases in soil organic matter. You can see improvements in measures of a healthy soil microbiome. And then an emerging area of interest across a lot of sectors is the increases that we see in carbon sequestration potential through perennial systems. This is typically going to be related to like the very large amount of biomass that is associated with tree species, but it's also going to be related to reducing tillage and having a constant cover on your soil. Economically, a lot of our tree crops are really high value or specialty products. If you have the acreage, an individual can also typically manage a greater acreage than what could be managed with an annual cropping system. And then in the long run, maybe not in the first few years, but you can reduce the input costs of a mature orchard compared to maybe an annual vegetable production system. So the potential for economic benefits when it comes to perennials is often related to how high value the crops are that are grown as a perennial. And then socioculturally, the benefits are also, important to know. People like to do activities like go apple picking in the fall, and fruit is really an essential part of so many cultures and in so many cuisines. And there's also a bunch of emerging evidence showing how urban and suburban trees can really provide a lot of human wellness benefits for people living in those areas. So I know I was quick to run through the benefits of tree crops, but there's an increasing interest in trees, and I think enough people know that they don't really need convincing that incorporating trees into their landscape is a good thing. But what they do need help with is figuring out what are the best ways to go about doing that. So that's where we'll move here, is how do you plan for an organic orchard and how do you get things into the ground. So moving forward, we'll touch on sort of how understanding the management's decisions helps us to control production risk. And we'll start with the basics of planning for a perennial orchard. So first up, you got to pick where you're going to plant. So site selection. Trees, they don't need frequent tillage, but you do want to consider your equipment needs, especially when you're faced with sloping land. Particularly for organic orchards, air and soil drainage are critical. Promoting airflow can help to reduce pest and disease pressures in the future. And soil drainage is pretty important for some of the soil-borne pathogens like Phytophthora. So making sure you have both air and soil drainage is important. And it's also important to think about whether you're planting near pest or other host habitat. Voles, mice, rodents, those sorts of things can be extremely devastating for a new orchard planting. We can see on this image here shows the development of frost pockets as it relates to the slope or the site that you've chosen, and where you're going to see the coldest temperatures in sloping terrain. So it's important to remember that avoiding frost pockets with your most sensitive crops is an important consideration for perennials particularly. Once you have an appropriate site identified, you can start thinking about species selection. So many people perhaps they've heard of the USDA hardiness zones. And they use these to determine the species that are viable for their area. I want to make sure to get across that, like, this is a guideline. The USDA hardiness zone really only provides the very basics. There are still going to be quite a few significant limitations related to the length of your growing season, your peak summer temperatures, wind, humidity, rainfall, what season you're getting rainfall in. So just going based off of a USDA hardiness zone is probably not going to, that's not enough information for you to make a species selection on. So experimenting with new species for your area it's high risk. It's potentially very high reward from a marketing perspective, but remember that there are these are long-term systems. So the risks of planting a crop that's not quite suited to your area is going to be compounded over many years, and you're not going to see the total losses from those until you get to the point where you're either are or are not harvesting a crop. I would say that it's probably not worth risking several years of acreage for a crop that may not survive or may not produce. Though that is again a marketing risk that you have to consider. The moral, I guess, of the story for choosing a species is that you just because your neighbor is growing it and you think you might be able to, they're growing it in their garden and you think it might do well, or just because it's in, the nursery says it's in your hardiness zone, make sure you're taking into consideration all of these other factors before you go out and plant it on a large acreage. And then once you have a species, thinking about rootstock selection is an important decision. The rootstock you choose is going to depend on your individual circumstances for why you need to choose a rootstock. So rootstocks can be chosen for pest resistance. They can be chosen for size control or for vigor. So a lot of rootstocks are chosen because they will reduce the size and reduce the vigor of the tree. Like you can see in this diagram here, just the specific names of the different rootstocks and how the size of the apple tree will react when it's grown on that rootstock. And then finally, people will choose rootstocks because the trees that are grown when using grafted trees, you're typically going to have higher precocity. So the trees will come and become fruiting trees earlier. They'll reach maturity earlier. And so I'm going to segue that into a quick description of grafting for those of you who are unfamiliar with that. So almost all of our major tree crops are produced using grafted trees at a commercial scale. Backyard growers, a lot of people are going to be relying on grafted trees. Essentially, what you're doing with grafting is you're taking a root system called the rootstock, which has whatever known characteristics or benefits that you're looking for. So this could be disease resistance, this could be vigor. So you're going to take that rootstock and you're going to graft a new variety on top of that. And that upper variety is called the scion. So maybe you'll choose a scion because it has great fruit quality or it's got super high yields. So the scion is kind of the fruit that you want, and the rootstock is typically going to be the characteristics that you want. And so you're grafting them together, and hopefully you're making a tree that is both resistant to soil-borne diseases and creates a great fruit at the same time. Some things to remember when you're going to be using grafted trees. Just like you can buy certified organic seed, you can also get certified virus or bacterial or fungal-free budwood and rootstock. So that's something to consider. Make sure you're buying from a reputable nursery if you're going to be buying budwood and rootstock. Getting certified virus-free wood is it can really make or break the ability of your orchard or your trees to survive and last. And then buying from a reputable nursery and deciding whether you're going to be doing the grafting yourself or whether you're going to buy pre-grafted plants is really an economic decision. I think grafting is fun and people should give it a go and people should try it. If you're doing it on a large scale, it may make more sense to buy pre-grafted trees. Again, I think that's an economic risk or a marketing risk to consider. Secondly, another consideration is that if you are organic certified and it's relevant to your operation, use the organic materials if it's required. And then a final thing to note is that a lot of growers maybe express concern or question whether using rootstocks grown from different techniques is going to have an effect on their final tree. A lot of nurseries these days are using tissue culture to develop their rootstocks or their rootstock liners. Some are using cuttings and some using seedlings, depending on which variety or species you've gone after. I think most of the research that is coming out of this is saying, don't actually worry about that. Get what's available and what's economically viable for you. So once you have your species and your rootstock, then you can start thinking about the scion or the variety that you're going to select. Often when you're making this decision, it's going to be a marketing decision, but there are management considerations to take into effect. So more vigorous varieties, for example, may require more water, and some varieties have different tolerances to pests, diseases, and insects. But when it really comes down to it, in terms of marketing, the scion you choose is likely going to be what's impacting the taste and the fruit size and the fruit quality. So depending on how you're marketing your fruits, that's really probably the direction that you're going to want to go in when it comes to making this variety selection. If you are offering like a U-pick operation, for example, planting an early, a mid, and a late season variety can really extend your marketing window. On the other hand, it could extend the costs required of your harvest window, depending on the size of your operation and what your operation is doing for harvest. When it comes to site preparation, this is really the most critical time for getting your orchard into the ground, particularly for organic growers and particularly for growers who are transitioning from trees into more trees. This site preparation is the time when you can prepare your field for the next 20, 30 plus years. If you have the capacity to set aside a full year for site preparation, that would be highly recommended in order to amend your soil and manage weeds or pests before planting. Many organic growers, this is the typical practice, many organic growers are going to use the first year of site preparation to manage conventionally using conventional products, and then switch to organic certified products during the juvenility stage of their orchard, or the unproductive period when their trees aren't producing fruit anyways. Like I mentioned, transitioning from trees into trees opens up a lot of possibilities of replant diseases. Fumigation is still the most effective method for commercial conventional growers, but there's a lot of emerging research with alternatives to that, such as solarization or biofumigation. So I encourage you to look at what has been effective in your region when it comes to alternatives to fumigation for transitioning and reducing the likelihood of replant diseases. Any of these actions, whichever actions you take, should be based on soil tests prior to site preparation for pathogen pressure, as well as for soil nutrients, salinity, pH. So make sure you're taking all of those soil tests before you start your site preparation, so you know what steps you need to take. When you are planting, you're typically going to be growing, or most orchards are going to grow in a north-south orientation to maximize canopy light interception. If you are planting on a slope, depending on the species and your location. You may want to avoid southern or western facing slopes because these will heat up earlier in the spring, and more risk of frost damage that way. But in some cases, maybe you want to have the warmer slope. So this is really going to depend on what species you're looking at and what region of the country or what region of the world you're in. So thinking about pests as well. So thinking about how close you are to inoculum or to pest sources. A very, very, very standard general recommendation is try to get at least 200 feet away. If you're planting something that squirrels or rodents can be attracted to, try to get 200 feet away from the nearest forest or the nearest woodlot or whatever that may be. Another general recommendation when it comes to the orchard layout is, what's the spacing between your rows? The ideal tree height, and again, super general recommendation, is that the ideal tree height is, half the row spacing plus 3 feet. That's a recommendation that supposedly maximizes the amount of light interception that you've got. But this is going to be very dependent on your species, whether you're trellising, what your within row spacing is. So thinking about what shape and what pruning effects, what sort of pruning you're going to be needing to do is all going to affect how you lay out your orchard. So regardless of how well you plan your orchard, though, there are going to be risks. So especially in an era of so much climate uncertainty, the environmental risks to fruit production can seem really overwhelming for everyone. So we're going to go through each of these, and I'll talk about a few of the techniques that growers are using to build resilience into their system in order to mitigate some of the effects of these environmental risks. So drought conditions seem like they're impacting more and more growers every year in every region of the country, all around the world. The number one recommendation for any grower almost anywhere now is to invest in irrigation capacity. When you have an orchard, you can't just fallow your field for a year because of a drought. Losing trees due to a lack of irrigation capacity is probably going to be very financially devastating. There are some options for, of course, choose species that are more drought tolerant. There are cultivars that are more drought tolerant, but even with these, I would still recommend investing in irrigation capacity. We're seeing droughts at times of years when you would typically historically have never seen that before. When you do have your irrigation capacity, whether that's a permanent system or just the availability of a water tank or of some sort, when you do have that all set up, make sure you are regularly checking your irrigation water quality for pH, as well as for alkalinity and salinity, to make sure you're not impacting your soil and negatively impacting your soil with poor irrigation water. And then a final recommendation for dealing with drought is building your soil organic matter. And this is going to be a recurring theme for almost all of the environmental risks that we talk about here. Building up your soil organic matter through mulches or compost application can really improve the water holding capacity of your soil significantly. In conjunction with this is deciding when you're going to be irrigating. Given how many areas now have restrictions on water use, making sure that you're not overwatering your plants can be just as important, especially from an economic or financial point of view, as making sure that they aren't underwatered. I would suggest moving away from sort of the conventional based irrigation monitoring, where you just pick a day and you irrigate for 3 hours on that day and that day, no matter what. So conventional day or time-based decisions. There are, more updated, more modern systems for monitoring irrigation, such as evapotranspiration-based systems, soil moisture-based systems, plant-based systems. These each have their ups and downs. Depending on where you live, I encourage you to use the most recent recommendations from your local extension offices or crop advisors, just to make sure you're maximizing water use efficiency sort of across the country and world. So not only are periods of drought increasing, but we are also seeing increased flood events. If you're in a flood susceptible area, it is definitely a good idea to choose species based on their flood tolerance. But it could be just as valuable to choose species based on disease tolerance to major soil-borne pathogens, things like Phytophthora. If you're these are the diseases that are going to most likely injure or kill your tree when it comes to a flood event, rather than the actual flooding inundation itself. If you are planting in a known flood-prone area, investing in drainage systems might be a cost-effective method. It's certainly not cheap, but it could be the only way you're going to be able to get a viable perennial system going. Testing for soil pathogens prior to planting, like we said with building, with checking your irrigation water, testing before you go about site preparation and planting to make sure you're not going to be battling Phytophthora throughout the lifespan of the orchard. And then again, even though it helps with drought, it's also going to be helping with flooding. Building your soil organic matter can help with soil drainage, and over time, it can help to mitigate some of these flood risks. So heat, we're ending summer here, but almost all over the country, all over the world, we're seeing more intense heat waves. The good news is most plants, most trees have the cellular mechanisms to handle really warm temperatures, warmer even than whatever predictions for climate change are estimating. So what does that mean? Arguably plants, particularly perennial plants, they're going to be able to survive extreme heat. Generally speaking, the problems are going to only arise at a cellular level when you don't have enough water. And this is for plants in particular. This is the ability of the plant itself to survive. Problem with heat is that when you get increases in water loss because of the heat, the heat itself is going to be increasing water loss, leading to drought effects or lack of water availability for the plant. The heat's also going to be, leading to greater soil water losses. All of this combines to increase the likelihood of water deficit. So investing in drought resilience technologies is likely going to mitigate a lot of the problems that might come to your plant from excess heat. Cover cropping is another great way to reduce soil temperatures and lower the ambient temperature in your orchard, affect the microclimate. And then trunk paint can also be an important solution for some growers, particularly with some species planted on south or western facing slopes. The big sort of problem that comes with heat is fruit quality can be impacted by extreme sunlight in heat. So misting technology is one approach in areas where there is ample water availability. But another option for maintaining fruit quality is this idea of shade cloth or netting. This image is at a very large scale. But this can also be done at sort of a smaller scale by covering plants individually. And this essentially is just reducing the likelihood of sun scald. In more integrated systems, so thinking like agroforestry type systems, when you are planting, it might make sense to rely on natural shading for sun protection, which again can help reduce some of the evaporative losses and reduce the risk of trunk scald or fruit scald when it comes to that. So we've all been experiencing, the heat waves of this summer, and many people have noticed and they understand that we're getting warmer winters. The average daytime temperature during the winter is just increasingly warmer. But the big issue that arises from this is actually that the average actual date of the last frost and the first frost so the last frost in the spring and the first frost in the fall are not actually changing that much. The problem isn't related to the warmer temperatures. It's that the frost temperatures or the frost dates haven't actually shifted to become earlier in the season, the date of that last frost. So this is a problem because if the tree has emerged from dormancy, 3 weeks early because there was warm average daytime temperatures, it is not going to be acclimated, so it won't be able to handle that, random frost that comes at a time when historically it would be perfectly normal to have that frost event. But because that tree has already emerged from dormancy, it's not, acclimated to that, and it's not prepared to handle it. And so that's where you're starting to see damage. What this comes down to is that in areas that often get frost, a tree is perfectly able to handle a frost event when it occurs, when it happens during a period when the tree is expecting it. Not to anthropomorphize trees, but it's when the trees are in a susceptible stage of development, the risks of loss associated with frost can be really extreme. So all through the winter, we're not generally concerned with frost in cold temperature. It's just during the periods when the tree isn't acclimated where we should be concerned and take steps to mitigate the potential damage. So you can see here in these images, you've just got early bud stage. We're probably not going to be super concerned with a frost event. Though once you move into later stages and early flowering, this is when we're going to start really being concerned about, when there's predictions for frost. So don't over concern yourself when a tree is not in a susceptible stage of development, but when it is in a susceptible stage, that's where you need to take steps to mitigate some of those risks. So one option is to invest in frost protection technologies. So at any scale, irrigation is a very common form of protection. A well irrigated tree with plenty of soil moisture is going to be less susceptible to frost damage. And then the irrigation itself can be a source of heat in the orchard if you have that irrigation going during a frost event. At a small scale, or even at a medium or larger size scale, growers can also choose to just individually cover each of their trees. So you can use nets, sheets, blankets. Really, typically when you're worried about a frost event and the effects of a frost event, it's only going to be a couple of degrees that's going to make the difference between, devastating and manageable. So even like a very light coating can help to raise that temperature. One of the best approaches is to also just avoid planting in frost pockets, like we talked about earlier, and maintaining air drainage and air movement. On a larger scale, orchard fans are pretty commonplace in an industry to encourage the mixing of air. And then another practice is to keep the area around your tree free of weeds. So this has been shown to help maintain air movement and keep the temperatures up in your orchard. Distinct from frost is the chill hour requirement of many tree species. So essentially this phenomenon is a yearly requirement that a perennial species has for cold temperatures. These are typically going to be measured as the number of hours a tree gets when the temperature is between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's kind of how it's calculated. That it shifts a little bit, but generally speaking, it's the hours between 32 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit that you get during the winter. This is the number that has really been dramatically shifting, not necessarily the frost-free date, but this number has definitely changed across many regions of the country, many regions around the globe. And growers, I would say, arguably should probably expect to continue to see winters with fewer chill hours. I would also argue that it's probably not currently a significant threat to Northeast growers because there's so many varieties that have chill hour requirements that are significantly less than what we already experience here in the Northeast, even with significant changes in climate. But for those who are in milder climates, it may be worth considering choosing varieties that have been selected for lower chill requirements. So you could maybe think about this: plant varieties now that are adapted to a region that are slightly, that region is slightly warmer than yours. It's certainly a risk, but I think we can probably guess that with the way that climate change is going, that might be the most reasonable approach towards dealing with chill hour requirements. Extreme weather events also seem to be on the uptick. Wind events maybe are the most significant. So hurricanes, tornadoes, derechos, they can cause massive damage at one time. So particularly if you're planting on top of a bare or elevated location, you should be aware of the dominant wind direction. Add in wind breaks of sturdy trees if it seems like that would be prudent. Be aware of the rootstock and scion vigor. So what I mean by this second bullet is that a very vigorous scion, so the top part of that system, can kind of overgrow a low vigor rootstock and create a really weak graft union. And that becomes a weak point for the entire system. So the tree can much more easily break or snap right at that graft union. If you're planting something on a trellis, you should definitely be very aware of the weight-bearing capacity of that trellis. Species like hardy kiwis can put on a ton of biomass each year, and really they'll weigh down your support system to the point where wind events can just completely destroy it if you're not taking into account how much more weight you're putting onto your trellis each year. Typically, so if you can avoid stakes and support systems from the very beginning, you're typically going to be getting a more resilient tree. The ability for a tree to kind of move and sway in the wind when it's young is actually physically strengthening the trunk so that it can handle things during wind events. If you do experience a wind event resulting in uprooted trees, get out there as soon as you can, as soon as it's safe, and try to straighten them. This obviously there's no guarantee that this will work, but it is worth the try. If you can go out there, one day after and pick your trees back up and tie them up for, try to get them to be established again, that can work. So don't see it as a total loss. It's not a guarantee, but it's worth trying. And then finally, understand your federal and state disaster relief policies. And you can talk to your local extension agents about this or crop advisors about this. So we touched on the environmental risks. And in our final stretch here, we'll look at some of the production risks, specifically related to organic orchards, and discuss some strategies for building resilience in the face of pest and disease pressures. And we'll touch on each of these risks, disease, insects, vertebrates, weed pressure, and time, specifically in the context of an organic orchard production system. So I've said it before, plan for at least a year of soil preparation before replanting if you can. Soil pathogens should be tested for and managed before you start planting, even before you start soil preparation, so you know what you're looking for. So when you can manage at least a year of soil testing and prep, you are setting yourself up for more likely success. when it comes to these soil-borne pathogens. And this, again, is particularly true where you're going to be replanting the same species into the same place. If you need to replant right where you just had the same trees before, at least shift your rows over. So if you were planting, at lines 1 and line 3, shift so you're planting at line 2 and line 4. Even that slight amount of difference can help with some replant issues. So be aware of replant diseases if that is a common issue in your species. Starting with a strong tree. So healthy, well-irrigated trees are also much more likely to tolerate or resist disease pressures. That said, if you do have a diseased tree with a known disease that can, spread to neighboring trees, it is absolutely in your best interest to remove this as soon as possible, if it's beyond the point where it can be managed. When it does come to management, speak to your local extension offices, pathologists, to understand what your management threshold is for what you're dealing with. There are definitely instances, even in organic situations, where the most appropriate course of action is just to let things run their course, and just let the issue stay. Economically, it doesn't make sense to try to manage it. Many diseases are going to proliferate most readily with water, whether that's rain or irrigation or humidity or morning dew. Keeping your flowers and leaves as dry as possible or drying them off as quickly as possible is usually going to be a good approach for almost every disease. Not everything, but a lot of them. And how to do that is maintaining airflow and air movement through your orchard setup and through pruning is usually going to be a really beneficial practice. Pruning and fertilizing at the correct time of year to not promote excess biomass is going to help make pruning a more economical practice, as well as help to maintain that airflow. These two photos here compare what a low density planting and a high density trellised planting of cherries looks like. If you're going to be running a commercial operation and you're planning to spray with crop protection materials, I think it's very important that you think about which of these two training systems are going to allow you to more effectively cover your plants with whatever crop protection materials you're applying. Particularly certified organic products, which are known to be less effective to begin with. Thoroughly and completely coating your plants is going to be likely far more effective in a system where there's only a single branch and a few smaller branches off of that you can fully cover with a aerial spray application, compared to a system which is has very large scaffolds and a very large trunk and a lot of nooks and crannies that aren't going to be thoroughly coated with a spray or other crop protection material. So insects, again, airflow with insects is also something that we can consider, but insects themselves can cause issues and blemishes. So especially on the left, if you have apples, I'm sure you've seen some curculio here, but insects can also be a huge issue because they really open up entry points for other diseases and for a lot of the rots and fungal pathogens. Organic techniques such as pheromone mating disruption are becoming increasingly utilized across conventional and organic industries. The formulations are becoming increasingly effective, and so if you have a large enough acreage to make these worthwhile, definitely the capacity for mating disruption, its effectiveness continues to increase. A huge strategy that I can't emphasize enough is winter sanitation, whether through livestock integration or mowing or the removal of mummy fruit, making sure that you clean up mummy fruit and you clean up all of these pathogens at the end of your growing season over the winter can really do wonders for what comes next year. And then finally, understanding which pests you have and their life cycle through insect monitoring is the only way you're going to be able to come up with an effective insect management practices. So understand your action threshold and use that to determine your spray timing. Running an insect spray program depends on you knowing what you have in your orchard and timing applications appropriately, especially when you're using these organic certified products. So monitoring for insects is the only way you can go about having an effective spray program. These two strategies here, maybe they're only relevant for smaller growers, but don't discount the idea of manually scouting and removing certain large leaf-eating insects. If you only have a dozen plants, it could be worth it to just go out and try to find that one that's really causing a lot of damage. And for some pests and some fruits, just individually covering each fruit with a paper bag or a mesh bag for a few weeks right before they are ripe, and that can really offer you a huge advantage. Maybe that's just for a backyard grower, but if you just have a tree or two, go out and cover your cover each of your individual fruits. It takes a little bit of time, but it's worth it to get a fruit that doesn't have bugs in it, I would think. I find that a lot of people ignore vertebrate pests, or they just think of them as sort of unmanageable. In this image, we can see two of our, very devastating vertebrate pests in the Northeast. On the left, you can see vole damage, and then the right, you see human damage, weed whacker damage. But number one, top of the list for most people is going to be deer. Investing in deer fencing is a startup cost that, absolutely no one wants to have, but for the sake of your own sanity, it's almost always a huge benefit in many locations, and it pays back in dividends. In addition to deer exclusion, though, managing your surrounding habitat to decrease both rodent and deer habitat can be an effective way to manage these vertebrates. Trunk guards can be effective when it comes to managing, mower or weed whacker damage, but they can also be a very comfortable, trunk guards can be a very comfortable hotel for rodents during the winter. So hitting the train the people that are working in your orchard to not run into your trees each time they drive through with a spray broom. So hitting the trunk of your tree with a weed whacker or a boom of some implement every week really negates a lot of the effort that you put in to having healthy trees. Every organic system struggles with weed pressure as sort of the number one production risk. Managing weeds prior to orchard establishment, so during your site preparation stage, is usually going to set you up for the greatest success. There's still a lot of work and research that needs to be done to identify the very best strategies for organic weed control in orchards. But a lot of growers are having great luck with mulches. They're having good luck with cover crops. The next slide, I'll show some of our mulch applicator, but just remember that mulch is going to retain moisture, and mulch can potentially be a great home for some of our vertebrate pests, like rodents. So be aware of both of these when you're scouting after mulch applications. I'll play this for 6 seconds here. So if you're going to be mulching on a large scale, investing in machinery such as a mulch applicator can really help you out, save some time and effort in the long run. I'll even play this for another 6 seconds, just because of how quickly and easily you can get mulch out into your field. And then the last production risk that I have here is time. So not only does it take 3 or 4 or 5 years after you plant a tree until you get a crop, but even for mature plantings, you're responsible for taking care of that fruit from the very early spring when the flowers first come out until, in some cases, middle or late fall. Compare that to like a leafy green vegetable, which is, in and out in 30 days. It's a long-term responsibility to take care of a perennial crop, both each and every year and also, for the lifespan of the orchard. So how do we deal with the time issue? First is, choose crops that are adapted to your conditions so that your management activities during the season are as low as possible, reduce some of those costs. If you basically, naturally help yourself by planting things that are adapted to your region to reduce your costs and your inputs. Diversification, I saved this for the end here so that, you all leave on this note. It can be applied to almost every risk that we, first defined, marketing, financial, and also every production risk that we went through. This diversification is going to allow you to explore new market opportunities. One example of diversification would be through the incorporation of agroforestry practices. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to provide growers with information about best practices for silvopasture or alley cropping and perennials. That's research that's ongoing. You're starting up here at Rodale. But there's also a lot of really great and innovative farms that are pioneering this effort and understanding the best techniques to diversify their perennial production systems. So that I want to be the final point to keep in your brain as we wrap up here. And with that, I want to thank you for joining today as we, had our overview of perennial production systems. Our research program is, moving forward to help to identify some of these best practices. But for now, I encourage you, if you have specific questions about specific species or anything, please feel free to reach out to me, and I will check in here to see if we have any questions. Again, if you could use the Q&A, that would be great. So we have one question about using SAP analysis. That is really going to depend on what it is you're trying to look at. I know there are certainly benefits to understanding nutrient availability within your tree, within your sap itself. I think that you can infer a lot of that information from a soil analysis. In general, I would say I'm not the strongest believer in foliar nutritional sprays, which I believe is what I see a lot of growers getting out of SAP analysis, is what nutritional foliar sprays to apply. I think the jury is still out on their effectiveness. I think that focusing on soil health is really that's how a tree evolved to take up nutrients, and that's probably the way going into the future that I think we should be looking at how to best manage fertility and nutrient management for our trees is through building soil health. You shouldn't need to have to, I think, apply foliar nutritional compounds. I'm glad to see in the chat that there's some excitement about perennial crop systems. We're certainly going to do our best to make sure that the information that growers need will start coming out of Rodale moving forward into the future. So there's one question about livestock integration and tree and protecting trees when you're integrating livestock. That is an area where every grower we talk to needs information on how you time livestock integration. I think right now the best we can offer when it comes to tree protection is if you can exclude livestock from an acre for 2 to 3 years while those trees gets established, that's going to be the best bet to make sure your trees are in shape. If you need to use, wire and poly line to rope off individual trees, I've also seen that as an effective approach. So there are ways to incorporate livestock into an early planting, but if you do have the capacity to exclude from a young installation, that's probably that's going to be the least risky option. But looking at poly lines and poly wire could work, or I've seen it work before. I'm going to answer one question about plant guilds and permaculture and design. So my focus right now is on orchard production systems and helping growers who want to grow organic orchard crops. So I don't have right now, Rodale doesn't have a major focus on permaculture. I think we can certainly use some of the ideas behind permaculture, such as incorporating multiple species, making sure we're taking advantage of the natural slopes and water availability on the land. But right now, the perennial systems approach is more towards orchard systems and making and approaching this as an agricultural food production system that we can scale up to large scale commercial growers. So certainly we want to incorporate the objectives of permaculture into any of our decisions, because they obviously are very important for human soil planetary health. And how do we incorporate those into an orchard setting for large scale growers? So how can we scale out organic orchard systems to all regions of the country? There's a question about when trees are older and how we can integrate livestock and whether we have to consider protecting the trees. I think the most I have seen about this is that when trees are older, they're generally going to be more resilient to integrating livestock. The timing is really what it comes down to. So when you have something on the ground, when you've got grass for, let's say we're talking about sheep. If you have plenty of grass on the ground, if you've got a cover crop on the ground that our sheep are interested in, they're going to stick with that until they get bored. So as soon as they start getting bored, or there isn't an availability of, grasses or whatever on the ground, that's when they're going to move into looking at the trees and trying things out. So it's really, I think, timing of getting your livestock moved through quickly enough so that they don't get bored with what's on the ground. A lot of growers don't use any specific protection for their trees when they're integrating livestock, as long as they're moving things through quickly enough. If you are an orchard grower, if you have an orchard and sort of a larger scale system, I think one of the most effective approaches that I have seen is working with a contract grower or a contract shepherd or a contract livestock person. It's really hard to be really good at growing trees and really good at managing animals. So I think if you can develop this partnership, there's a lot more contract livestock operations popping up. So finding someone who wants to run their sheep through your orchard for a few days, so that you don't have to manage the sheep, and you can let them manage the sheep and you just manage your trees, or other way around. I think that's an approach that I've seen as really economically beneficial for both the grower and the shepherd or livestock person. So I think we're right about at 3 o'clock here. So I want to say again, thank you for joining us. Please feel free to reach out with specific questions. My email is here, and thank you again.